Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. It is a somber day, of course, as we remember the 9/11 terror attacks 17 years after that horrific day. Bagpipers and drummers from the NYPD, the fire department, and the Port Authority police participated in the ceremony as they escorted the American flag on the plaza where the towers once stood. Then the names of the nearly 3,000 victims were read as friends, family, and New York leaders, including Governor Cuomo and the New York State Senate delegation, looked on and listened.
Christy A. Adamo.
Terrence Edward Adderley Jr.
Sophia B. Otto.
Lee Adler.
Daniel Thomas Afflito.
Emmanuel Akwazi Afwakwa.
In Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where Flight 93 crashed, a 93-foot-tall monument was unveiled over the weekend. It features 40 wind chimes, one for each passenger who died that day. President Trump and the First Lady, they were on hand today for the memorial ceremony held in the field where the plane went down.
17 years ago, 40 incredible men and women showed the whole world that no force on earth will ever conquer the American spirit. We treasure their memory, we cherish their legacy, and we ask God to forever bless the immortal heroes of Flight 93.
At the Pentagon, a flag was unfurled right after sunrise at the exact spot where Flight 77 hit the building that day, and the names of the 184 victims were read.
Scott Powell. Captain Jack D. Punches, United States Navy, retired.
Vice President Mike Pence, he spoke at the ceremony.
Now, while many of us remember that day like it was yesterday, a growing number of Americans have no living memory of what happened here. Roughly 1/4 of our people were born after September the 11th, 2001. So we gather here today to reflect on what we remember, to remember the fallen, their families, and the heroes that day. But be assured, we also gather here to ensure that each succeeding generation knows the story of what happened that dark day.
Now, of course, none of us will ever forget where we were that day, and we'd like to hear from you so you can share your stories. You see on the screen right there our toll-free number. We've decided to open it up tonight. In fact, it's open as we speak, 38766-2428. What I'd like to do is I'd like to hear your memories of 9/11, and we'll also discuss where we have gone as a country since in those 17 years. You know, for the past 16 years, this calendar day triggers an unmistakable deja vu, and I know I'm not alone there. Now, for many of those years, even though, like many of you, I knew someone in the towers, I did not lose a spouse, a parent, a sibling, or a loved one. I just assumed this recoil came from my job, but this morning, I wasn't, like in many years past, sitting in the control room at 8 o'clock getting ready for these moving ceremonies. But yet that unmistakable pit still sat in my stomach. And I'll share with you why in a minute. But tonight, I wanted to spend most of this hour talking about why I don't believe we should turn the page. I want to discuss how that awful day confirmed our capacity for compassion and also may have unleashed some of our worst instincts that I believe we still struggle with. Tonight, I, along with Andrew and Dominic, as I said, we're going to open up the phone lines to you and we're going to ask you how 9/11 impacted you and how 17 years later, how it's impacted us as a nation. Now, my story is not a unique one. Like most of us, that brilliant September morning, it started with promise, a cloudless sky, My wife carrying out our first unborn child, heading out to work at an event leading from our suburban house to an event in southern New York. Soon after, as I headed north, I got a call where I was asked about that report of a plane that crashed into the tower. I said to her, it's a tragedy, but it's an accident. Well, not long after, obviously the second plane would hit. It would be hours before my wife and I connected again. In the meantime, all of us in similar situations, we imagined the worst in our personal lives. For thousands, those nightmare scenarios, they became realities. For the fortunate ones, like myself, our lives, they were not torn apart. But like all of us, I think, we would be forever changed. It is strange what stays with you. And each of us have our own stories, none one better than the rest. A year before the attacks, my wife and I were on a honeymoon. We went on a cruise and were assigned, like many of you know on cruises, kind of like kids in grade school, you were assigned seating with a bunch of strangers. You had Dusty and her husband from Arizona, Tyrone and his wife from Detroit, Eric and his girlfriend from Maine, etc. In all, 8 other people who couldn't look, sound, or think more different from all different parts of this country, red and blue state alike. For a week, we got together at a table and we had too much food and too much drink. Anyway, after the goodbyes, I never thought our paths would ever cross again. But by the end of September 12th, they all somehow, some way found me and reached out to my wife and I and asked if we were okay. That's a snapshot of what went on across this country. I witnessed hundreds of acts of random kindness, not for the cameras, but because for that chapter in time, we all remembered or discovered that we were part of something bigger than ourselves. Every day, I drive a long stretch of the New York State Thruway to work, and I will never forget the flags, the soldiers, and the strangers crying. I'll never forget worrying about the world that we were about to bring a child into, and at the same time, never prouder of being both a New Yorker and an American. I was proud of my president, even if I didn't vote for him, when he stood on the rubble and he shouted into the bullhorn. And I cheered as hell when he threw a perfect strike at Yankee Stadium. For a while there, we weren't playing shirts and skins in the political gladiator arena. Of course, the inevitable and important debates over war, surveillance, torture, and so much more would fracture that short-term common purpose. But those debates are fights that as adults in this country, we have a right and a responsibility to debate what kind of a nation America should be. Well, those are debates we should have. Today, however, that pit in my stomach was still there, not just because of what took me back 17 years earlier, but because of how distant the aftermath of 17 years ago seems. On a day when we remember not just the fallen, but also acknowledge the unbelievable heroism of those in the front lines that day, I got up this morning to my president, who started a day of solemn remembrance by tweeting attacks against the FBI and whining about an investigation into his possible personal culpability. But lest anyone be surprised about Mr. Trump's inability to ever put anyone over self, I want to remind you what Donald Trump said 17 years ago, just hours after we were attacked and hours after the towers had just collapsed.
40 Wall Street actually was the second tallest building in downtown Manhattan, and it was actually, before the World Trade Center, was the tallest. And then when they built the World Trade Center, it became known as the second tallest, and now it's the tallest.
The idea that, I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone in my life who would think that you monopolize a tragedy for self-promotion and that somehow he as the president is something, maybe it's my fault, but I just cannot compute. He, of course, over the years, he'd perpetuate lies. He would talk about the cheering crowds in Jersey City as the towers fell. Those crowds never existed. He would brag that he predicted the towers would be attacked before anyone else, like that was a sense of accomplishment. He would use the anniversary to attack, in his words, losers and haters on the solemn day of 9/11. Our president. But it's not just the tone deafness and the disrespect for the fallen. He and others, and this galls me to no end, pretend that they now and always have honored the fallen. Ted Cruz today, he tweeted his respect for those lost on 9/11. But I gotta tell you, he and 30 some other odd Republicans in the Senate, they fought tooth and nail to withhold funding for the September 11th victims because, well, we came from blue states. There's a Droga bill. It languished for years in Congress for renewal, as red state Republicans refused to extend health coverage for those sickened by the attacks. By the way, that Droga opposition also had a silent ally in one Donald Trump. While the Donald was vocal for every opportunity he could be to be a tax cheat or to get government subsidies for building projects, he resisted the idea over the years of helping those who spend day after day sifting through the wreckage trying to find the remains of their fellow Americans. Listen, I could go on here with my despondence at the station we find America in on this unfortunate anniversary, but I'll just leave it at this. I have seen America at its best and worst. And as we remember, as we need to today, those no longer with us, we owe them more than self-centered tweets. We owe them a lot more. Now, coming up next, I want to hear from you. I told you the phone lines are open. You see the number right now. I want to ask you what you remember of that fateful day, your personal stories, but also, with the benefit of looking 17 years later, where we are as a nation. Phone lines open again, 888-766-2428. Andrew, Dominic will join me, and you as well. I'll get to your phone calls right after this.
Richard Edward Bosco.
And my mother, Susan Klein. We love and miss you very much. Rest in peace.